Well, hello there. Welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each episode will read about 30 minutes out of a history book. We're reading A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We are in the middle of chapter 19 called Surprises, reading about women's liberation. Let's dig in. The right to abortion became a major issue. Before 1970, about 1 million abortions were done every year, of which only about 10,000 were legal. Perhaps a third of the women having illegal abortions, mostly poor people, had to be hospitalized for complications. How many thousands died as a result of these illegal abortions, no one really knows. But the illegalization of abortion clearly worked against the poor, for the rich could manage either to have their baby or to have their abortion under safe conditions. Court actions to do away with the laws against abortions were begun in over 20 states between 1968 and 1970, and public opinion grew stronger for the right of women to decide for themselves without government interference. In the book Sisterhood is Powerful, an important collection of women's writing around 1970, an article by Lucinda Sisler, Unfinished Business, Birth Control, said that abortion is a women's right. No one can veto her decision and compel her to bear a child against her will. In the spring of 1969, a Harris poll showed that 64% of those polled thought the decision on abortion was a private matter. Finally, in early 1973, the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, Doe v. Bolton, that the state could prohibit abortions only in the last 3 months of pregnancy, that it would regulate abortion for health purposes during the second 3 months of pregnancy, and during the first 3 months, a woman and her doctor had the right to decide. There was a push for child care centers, and although women did not succeed in getting much help from government, thousands of cooperative child care centers were set up. Women also began to speak openly for the first time about the problem of rape. Each year, 50,000 rapes were reported and many more were unreported. Women began taking self-defense courses. There were protests against the way police treated women, interrogated them, insulted them when women filed rape charges. A book by Susan Brown Miller, Against Our Will, was widely read. It is a powerful, indignant history and analysis of rape, suggesting self-defense, individual or collective. Fighting back, on a multiplicity of levels, that is the activity we must engage in together if we women are to redress the imbalance and rid ourselves and men of the ideology of rape. Rape can be eradicated, not merely controlled or avoided on an individual basis, but the approach must be long-range and cooperative and must have the understanding and goodwill of many men as well as women. Many women were active in trying to get a constitutional amendment, ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, passed by enough states, but it seemed clear that even if it became law, it would not be enough. That what women had accomplished had come through organization, action, protest. Even where the law was helpful, it was helpful only if backed by action. Shirley Chisholm, a black congresswoman, said, "The law cannot do it for us. We must do it for ourselves. Women in this country must become revolutionaries. We must refuse to accept the old, the traditional roles and stereotypes. We must replace the old negative thoughts about our femininity with positive thoughts and positive action." Perhaps the most profound effect of the women's movement of the 60s, beyond the actual victories on abortion in job equality, was called consciousness raising, often done in women's groups. which met in homes all across the country. This meant the rethinking of roles, the rejection of inferiority, the confidence in self, a bond of sisterhood, a new solidarity of mother and daughter. The Atlanta poet Esta Seton wrote her life. This is the picture that keeps forming in my mind. My young mother, barely 17, cooking their kosher dinner on the coal stove that first winter in Vermont, and my father, mute in his feelings except when he shouted, eating to show his love. 50 years later, her blue eyes would grow cold with the shock of that gray house and the babies one after another, and the doctor who said, "If you don't want any more children, move out of the house." For the first time, the sheer biological uniqueness of women was openly discussed. Some theorists thought that this was more fundamental to their oppression than any particular economic system. It was liberating to talk frankly about what had for so long been secret, hidden, cause for shame and embarrassment: menstruation, masturbation, menopause, abortion, lesbianism. One of the most influential books to appear in the early 70s was a book assembled by 11 women in the Boston Women's Health Book Collective called Our Bodies, Ourselves. It contained an enormous amount of practical information on women's anatomy, on sexuality, on sexual relationships, on lesbianism, on nutrition and health, on rape, self-defense, venereal disease, birth control, abortion, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause. More important even than the information, the charts, the photos, the candid exploration of the previously unmentioned, was the mood of exuberance throughout the book, the enjoyment of the body, the happiness with the newfound understanding, the new sisterhood with young women, middle-aged women, older women. They quoted the English suffragette Christabel Pankhurst. "Remember the dignity of your womanhood. Do not appeal. Do not beg. Do not grovel. Take courage. Join hands. Stand beside us. Fight with us." The fight began, many women were saying, with the body, which seemed to be the beginning of the exploitation of women as sex plaything, weak and incompetent, as pregnant woman, helpless, as middle-aged woman, no longer considered beautiful, as older woman, to be ignored, set aside. A biological prison had been created by men and society. As Adrienne Rich said, "Women are controlled by lashing us to our bodies." She wrote, "I have a very clear, keen memory of myself the day after I was married. I was sweeping a floor. Probably the floor did not really need to be swept. Probably I simply did not know what else to do with myself. But as I swept that floor, I thought, now I am a woman. This is an age-old action. This is what women have always done. I felt I was bending to some ancient form, too ancient to question. This is what women have always done." As soon as I was visibly and clearly pregnant, I felt for the first time in my adolescent and adult life not guilty. The atmosphere of approval in which I was bathed, even by strangers on the street, it seemed, was like an aura I carried with me in which doubts, fears, misgivings met with absolute denial. This is what women have always done. Rich said women could use the body as a resource rather than a destiny. Patriarchal systems, she said, whether under capitalism or socialism, limited women's bodies to their own needs. She discussed the training of passivity in women. Generations of schoolgirls were raised on Little Women, where Jo is told by her mother, I am angry nearly every day of my life, Jo, but I have learned not to show it, and I still hope to learn not to feel it, though it may take me another 40 years to do so. Male doctors and used instruments to bring our children, replacing the sensitive hands of midwives in the era of anesthetized, technologized childbirth. Rich disagreed with her fellow feminist Firestone, who wanted to change the biological inevitability of childbirth because it is painful and a source of subordination. She wanted, under different social conditions, to make childbirth a source of physical and emotional joy. One could not talk of Freud's ignorance of women, Rich said, as his one blind spot, which implied that in other matters his vision was clear. Such ignorance distorts all. There is a dilemma of the body. I know no woman, virgin, mother, lesbian, married, celibate, whether she earns her keep as a housewife, a cocktail waitress, or a scanner of brainwaves, for whom her body is not a fundamental problem. Its clouded meaning, its fertility, its desire, its so-called frigidity, its bloody speech, its silences, its changes and mutilations, its rapes and ripenings. Her reply to this, the repossession of our bodies, a world in which every woman is the presiding genius of her own body, as a basis for bringing forth not just children, but new visions, new meanings, a new world. For most women who were not intellectuals, the question was even more immediate. How to eliminate hunger, suffering, subordination, humiliation in the here and now. A woman named Johnny Tillman wrote in 1972, I'm a woman, I'm a black woman, I'm a poor woman, I'm a fat woman, I'm a middle-aged woman, and I'm on welfare. I have raised 6 children. I grew up in Arkansas, worked there for 15 years in a laundry, moved to California. In 1963, I got too sick to work anymore. Friends helped me to go on welfare. Welfare is like a traffic accident. It can happen to anybody, but especially it happens to women. And that is why welfare is a women's issue. For a lot of middle-class women in this country, women's liberation is a matter of concern. For women on welfare, it's a matter of survival. Welfare, she said, was like a super sexist marriage. You trade in a man for the man. I like that. The man runs everything, controls your money. She and other welfare mothers organized a national welfare rights organization. They urged that women be paid for their work, housekeeping, child rearing. No woman can be liberated until all women get off their knees. And the problem of women was the germ of a solution, not only for their oppression, but for everybody's. The control of women in society was ingeniously effective. It was not done directly by the state. Instead, the family was used. Men to control women, women to control children, all to be preoccupied with one another, to turn to one another for help, to blame one another for trouble, to do violence to one another when things weren't going right. Why could this not be turned around? Could women liberating themselves, children freeing themselves, men and women beginning to understand one another, find the source of their common oppression outside rather than in one another? Perhaps then they could create nuggets of strength in their own relationships, millions of pockets of insurrection. They could revolutionize thought and behavior in exactly that seclusion of family privacy which the system had counted on to do its work of control and indoctrination. And together, instead of at odds, male, female, parents, children, they could undertake the changing of society itself. It was a time of uprisings. If there could be rebellion inside that most subtle and complex of prisons, the family, it was reasonable that there be rebellions in the most brutal and obvious of prisons, the penitentiary system itself. In the 60s and early 70s, those rebellions multiplied. They also took on an unprecedented political character and the ferocity of class war, coming to a climax at Attica, New York in September of 1971. The prison had arisen in the United States as an attempt at Quaker reform to replace mutilation, hanging, exile, the traditional punishments during colonial times. The prison was intended, through isolation, to produce repentance and salvation. But prisoners went insane and died in that isolation. By mid-19th century, the prison was based on hard labor, along with various punishments, sweat boxes, iron yokes, solitary. The approach was summed up by the warden at the Ossining, New York Penitentiary. In order to reform a criminal, you must first break his spirit. That approach persisted. Prison officials would convene annually to congratulate themselves on the progress being made. The president of the American Correctional Association, delivering the annual address in 1966, described the new edition of the Manual of Corrective Standards. It permits us to linger, if we will, at the gates of correctional Valhalla, with an abiding pride in the sense of a job superbly well done. We may be proud, we may be satisfied, we may be content. He said this just after, in the midst of, and just before, the most intense series of prison uprisings the country had ever seen. There had always been prison riots. A wave of them in the 1920s ended with a riot at Clinton, New York, a prison of 1,600 inmates which was suppressed with 3 prisoners killed. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 50 major riots occurred in American prisons. In the early 1960s, prisoners on a working in Georgia smashing rocks used the same sledgehammers to break their legs to call attention to their situation of daily brutality. At San Quentin Prison in California, which housed 4,000 prisoners, there was a series of revolts in the late 60s, a race riot in 1967, a united black and white general strike in early 1968 that shut down almost all of the prison industries, and then a second strike that summer. At the Queen's House of Detention on Long Island in New York in the fall of 1970, prisoners took over the jail, took hostages, issued demands. The prisoners' negotiating committee included 4 blacks, 1 Puerto Rican, 1 white. They demanded immediate bail hearings on 47 cases that they said were examples of racism in the granting of bail. Judges came inside the prison, granted some paroles and reductions, and the hostages were released. But when the prisoners continued to hold out, police stormed the jail with tear gas and clubs, and the revolt was over. Around the same time, in November 1970, in Folsom Prison in California, a work stoppage began, which became the longest prison strike in the history of the United States. Most of the 2,400 prisoners held out in their cells for 19 days without food, in the face of threats and intimidation. The strike was broken with a combination of force and deception, and 4 of the prisoners were sent on a 14-hour ride to another prison, shackled and naked on the floor of a van. One of the rebels wrote, "The spirit of awareness has grown. The seed has been planted." The prisons in the United States had long been an extreme reflection of the American system itself. The stark life differences between rich and poor, the racism, the use of victims against one another, the lack of resources of the underclass to speak out, the endless reforms that changed little. Dostoevsky once said, "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." It had long been true, and prisoners knew this better than anyone, that the poorer you were, the more likely you were to end up in jail. This was not just because the poor committed more crimes. In fact, they did. The rich did not have to commit crimes to get what they wanted. The laws were on their side. The rich also bribed politicians to change the laws, right? But sorry, I usually try to leave my personal politics out of this. I just couldn't resist. But when the rich did commit crimes, they often were not prosecuted. Oh! And if they were, they could get out on bail, hire clever lawyers, get better treatment from judges. Somehow the jails ended up full of poor black people. In 1969, there were 502 convictions for tax fraud. Such cases, called white-collar crimes, usually involve people with a good deal of money. Of those convicted, 20% ended up in jail. The fraud averaged $190,000 per case. Their sentences averaged 7 months. That same year, for burglary and auto theft, crimes of the poor, 60% ended up in prison. The auto thefts averaged $992. The sentences averaged 18 months. The burglaries averaged $321. The sentences averaged 33 months. Willard Galen, a psychiatrist, relates a case with changes in details. A case which, with changes in details, could be multiplied thousands of times. Excuse me. We had just interviewed 17 Jehovah's Witnesses. He had just interviewed 17 Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to register for the draft during the Vietnam War, and all had received 2-year sentences. He came to a young black man who had notified his draft board he could not in conscience cooperate with the draft because he was repelled by the violence of the Vietnam War. He received a 5-year sentence. Galen writes, "Hanks was the first 5-year sentence I had encountered. He was also the first black man. There were additional factors." "How was your hair then?" I asked. "Afro." "And what were you wearing?" "A dashiki." "Don't you think that might have affected your sentence?" "Of course." "Was it worth a year or two of your life?" I asked. "That's all of my life," he said, looking at me with a combination of dismay and confusion. "Man, don't you know? That's what it's all about. Am I free to have my style? Am I free to have my hair? Am I free to have my skin?" "Of course," I said. You're right." Galen found enormous discretion given to judges in the handing out of sentences. In Oregon, of 33 men convicted of violating the draft law, 18 were put on probation. In southern Texas, of 16 men violating the same law, none was put on probation, and in southern Mississippi, every defendant was convicted and given the maximum of 5 years. In one part of the country, New England, the average sentence for all crimes was 11 months. In another part, the South, it was 78 months. But it wasn't simply a matter of North and South. In New York City, one judge handling 673 persons brought before him for public drunkenness, all poor. The rich get drunk behind closed doors. Discharged 531 of them. Another judge, handling 566 persons on the same charge, discharged one person. With such power in the hands of the courts, the poor, the black, the odd, the homosexual, the hippie, the radical are not likely to get equal treatment before judges who are almost uniformly white, upper middle class, orthodox. While in any one year, 1972 for instance, perhaps 375,000 people will be in jail, county or city, or in prisons, state or federal, and 54,000 in juvenile detention. There will also be 900,000 under probation and 300,000 on parole, a total of 1,600,000 people affected by the criminal justice system. Considering turnover in any one year, several million people will come in and go out of this system. It is a population largely invisible to middle-class America. But if 20 million blacks could be invisible for so long, why not 4 or 5 million criminals? A study by the Children's Defense Fund in the mid-70s revealed that more than 900,000 young people under 18 are jailed in the course of a year. Anyone trying to describe the reality of prison falters. A man in Walpole Prison in Massachusetts wrote, "Every program that we get is used as a weapon against us. The right to go to school, to go to church, to have visitors, to write, to go to the movies. They all end up being weapons of punishment. None of the programs are ours. Everything is treated as a privilege that can be taken away from us. The result is insecurity, a frustration that keeps eating away at you." Another Walpole prisoner, "I haven't eaten in the mess hall for 4 years. I just couldn't take it anymore. You'd go into the serving line in the morning and 100 or 200 cockroaches would go running away from the trays. The trays were grimy and the food was raw or had dirt or maggots in it. Many a night I'd go hungry, living on peanut butter and sandwiches, getting a loaf of bread here or a hunk of bologna there. Other guys couldn't do that because they didn't have my connections or they didn't have money for the canteen." Communication with the outside world was difficult. Guards would tear up letters. Others would be intercepted and read. Jerry Souza, a prisoner at Walpole in 1970, sent 2 letters, one to a judge, the other to the parole board, to tell about a beating by guards. They went unanswered. 8 years later, at a court hearing, he discovered the prison authorities had intercepted them, never sent them out. The families suffered with the prisoner. "During the last lockup, my 4-year-old son sneaked off into the yard and picked me a flower. A guard in the tower called the warden's office and a deputy came in with the state police at his side. He announced that if any child went into the yard and picked another flower, all visits would be terminated." He doesn't say who said that, but it was in quotations. The prison rebellions of the late 60s and early 70s had a distinctly different character than the earlier ones. The prisoners in the Queen's House of Detention referred to themselves as revolutionaries. All over the country, prisoners were obviously affected by the turmoil in the country, the Black Revolt, the youth upsurge, the anti-war movement. The events of those years underlined what prisoners already sensed, that whatever crimes they had committed, the greatest crimes were being committed by the authorities who maintained the prisons, by the government of the United States. The law was being broken daily by the president, sending bombers to kill, sending men to be killed outside the Constitution, outside the highest law of the land. State and local officials were violating the civil rights of black people which was against the law, and were not being prosecuted for it. Literature about the black movement, books on the war, began to seep into the prisons. The example set in the streets by blacks, by anti-war demonstrators, was exhilarating. Against a lawless system, defiance was the only answer. It was a system which sentenced Martin Sostra, a 52-year-old black man running an Afro-Asian bookstore in Buffalo, New York, to 25 to 30 years in prison for allegedly selling $15 worth of heroin to an informer who later recanted his testimony. The recantation did not free Sostra. He could find no court, including the Supreme Court of the United States, to revoke the judgment. He spent 8 years in prison, was beaten 10 times by guards, spent 3 years in solitary confinement, battling and defying the authorities all the way until his release. Such injustice deserved only rebellion. There had always been political prisoners, people sent to jail for belonging to radical movements, for opposing war. But now a new kind of political prisoner appeared, the man or woman convicted of an ordinary crime who in prison became awakened politically. Some prisoners began making connections between their personal ordeal and the social system. They then turned not to individual rebellion but to collective action. They became concerned amid an environment whose brutality demanded concentration on one's own safety, an atmosphere of cruel rivalry for the rights, the safety of others. George Jackson was one of these new political prisoners. In Soledad Prison, California, on an indeterminate sentence for a $70 robbery, having already served 10 years of it, Jackson became a revolutionary. He spoke with a fury that matched his condition. This monster, the monster they've engendered in me, will return to torment its maker. From the grave, the pit, the profoundest pit, hurl me into the next existence. The descent into hell won't turn me. I'm going to charge them reparations in blood. I'm going to charge them like a maddened, wounded, rogue male elephant, ears flared, trunk raised, trumpet blaring. War without terms. A prisoner like this would not last. And when his book, Soledad Brother, became one of the most widely read books of black militancy in the United States, by prisoners, by black people, by white people, perhaps this ensured he would not last. All my life I've done exactly what I wanted to do, just when I wanted. No more, perhaps less sometimes, but never any more, which explains why I had to be jailed. I never adjusted. I haven't adjusted even yet, with half of my life already in prison. He knew what might happen. Born to a premature death, a menial subsistence wage worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the cot, the man under hatches without bail, that's me, the colonial victim. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow, with complete immunity. In August 1971, he was shot in the back by guards at San Quentin Prison while he was allegedly trying to escape. The state's story was full of holes. Prisoners in jails and state prisons all over the country knew, even before the final autopsy was in, even before later disclosures suggested a government plot to kill Jackson, that he had been murdered for daring to be a revolutionary in prison. Shortly after Jackson's death, there was a chain of rebellions around the country. In San Jose Civic Center Jail, in Dallas County Jail, in Suffolk County Jail in Boston, in Cumberland County Jail in Bridgeton, New Jersey, and Bexar County Jail in San Antonio, Texas. The most direct effect of the George Jackson murder was the rebellion at Attica Prison in 1971. Let's talk about Attica next time, and we'll stop there. I wanna wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Festivus to the rest of us. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the reading. Hit the like button, the subscribe button, the notification bell, any other button that seems to fit your mood, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.